Welcome to a Little Wayward podcast coming out of St. Therese Institute of Faith and Mission. I'm Nick and...
I'm Jim.
All right. So in today's podcast, some of you listening in or watching in might notice that we have a few new fancy gigs. So we had a very nice little donation from Beata and Mirek Bator of, what is it again? Sorry, Eternity Fine Julian Heirlooms in Alberta.
In
Grand Prairie, that's right. They heard that we were looking for some new chairs for the set, and so they graciously piped up and sent a donation. So just thought it would be good to send a shout out to you for your generosity, and thank you so much. They're quite comfortable.
And a sigh of satisfaction. Good. Thank you.
Exactly. Anyways, no, that's great. In fact, it kind of makes me look at other aspects of the set, and it's like, oh, that's a little dirtier than I thought it was. But anyways, one step at a time. But anyways, how are you doing today, Jim?
I'm doing fine, Nick. Doing fine. I see you're sporting some St. Therese swag there today.
That's right, and it can be yours for just $35.99. I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, it just felt a little more casual today, and St. Therese swag's quite nice, I find. So.
Yeah, that's great. Good.
Yeah.
Cool. So what are we talking about? You had read something in your studies. You were preparing for a church history class, I believe you're saying.
That's right. So
came across an interesting notion.
Yeah, as one does when one studies church history. But back in September, actually, I was preparing for my first history class in October. And so one of the first things I do in my history class is I do a theology of history, getting the Christian perspective on history, or at least a theory of it. It's not doctrinal, it's just a lot of theological speculation. And so I was reading for it and trying to scratch my head around it. And there was something that came up in one of my readings that I found was absolutely fascinating. And this was actually in a book called A Theology of History by Urs von Balthasar. And I think it's worthwhile reading actually the quote that I found really striking, because I think it'll make for a really good discussion.
You copied it from me, which I'm grateful for, so
I'll
follow along with you.
All for killing a few more trees. That's a joke, by the way. Anyway, so the quote actually...
You forgot your Laudato Si there, Nick.
Yeah, I forgot my Laudato Si. Yeah, Pope Francis is sad with me somewhere in the cosmos. Pope Francis just woke up and he's like, I sense a disturbance.
Disturbance in the force.
Yeah, disturbance in the force. But anyways, he would agree with this quote, therefore, I think, though. This is the quote: all sin consists essentially in breaking out of time. Oh. So let's continue here. Hence, the restoration of order by the Son of God had to be an annulment of that premature snatching at knowledge, the beating down of the hand outstretched towards eternity, the repentant return from a false, swift transfer into eternity to a true, slow confinement in time.
Wow. Let's just take that one again.
Yeah, it's a lot.
That's a power-packed.
Yeah, there's a lot of things where it's almost like you just feel it get hit harder and harder and harder. So Urs von Balthasar says, in the context of discussing Christ's mode of time and what it refers to for us human beings, he says that all sin consists essentially in breaking out of time. Hence, the restoration of order by the Son of God had to be the annulment, or reducing to nullity, reducing to nothing, of that premature snatching at knowledge, the beating down of the hand outstretched towards eternity, trying to grasp eternity on our own terms. The repentant return from a false, swift transfer into eternity to a true, slow confinement in time. Which, that kind of logically flows. A false, swift transfer into eternity, in other words, trying to enter into eternity by our own volition and our own design. Though we all, as human beings, we all love the quick and easy, But often virtue and really doing anything of worthwhile in life takes a lot of slow, steady, often painful commitment at times.
Yeah, the slow progress of things. The paragraph here, what was helpful for me was before that it speaks, he's speaking about Irenaeus and Clement, considering the original sin consisted in anticipation of this kind. Indeed, at the close of Revelation, the reward which the Son bestows on the victor is the fruit of paradise, which the sinner had to his own hurt, stolen in anticipation. So it's taking ahead of God's time, what God in his time would like to bestow.
Yeah, and I mean, that actually makes total sense, because when you actually look at the temptation of Adam and Eve in the garden, the temptation was to take the fruit so that they could become, quote unquote, like God.
Which was
Well, they were already made in the image and likeness.
and the promise of God was to draw and continue to allow, to draw them into the sharing of his nature.
Yeah, exactly. And this was to be accomplished in God's time, and thus there was to be a lot of there was to be this waiting, and it was actually God wanted them to exist in time and to actually come to that choice in time towards himself.
Yeah.
And we even see that as Christ. But what's even more striking that Urs von Balthasar says is that hence the importance of patience in the New Testament, which becomes the basic constituent of Christianity, more central even than humility. Patience as being more central even than humility is pretty powerful.
Because humility is the first virtue that must be learned in order to grow in all of this. It's a foundational virtue.
Yeah.
What I understand being said here is that the necessity of humility is not being called into question.
Of course, yeah.
Without that sense of humility. And that groundedness to the created order that we all accept, that's what the virtue of humility, the word humility means. It's like of the earth, that we are of the earth.
Yeah.
We are here still smelling the odor of ash that was sprinkled upon us not a few, just a couple of days ago. So, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Remember, man, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. That's the humility, is that remembering whence we come and whence God comes. So we realize that the next step from that is just what you're suggesting. Patience is central to that. We have to be willing to be patient in our creatureliness.
Yeah, and so like this notion of like sin breaking out of time, and like the response being patience, it's weird because when I first came across this, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. It's like, whoa. And actually, in fact, you can even see it in my notes.
Yeah, I love how you have this underlined. And you ran out of kinds of underlining, so you started creating other kinds of underlining to greater emphasis.
Yeah, exactly. It was like I circled it, I put it in square brackets, I put it in exclamation
dashed
points.
Underline.
There's like dashed underlines. This was like one of those big wow moments because the more and more you kind of think about it, the more and more it makes sense. Because I don't know, like the notion of sin as breaking out of time. For me, I always have loved the concept of time travel. And I've often thought about Jesus Christ entering into history as being a form of divine time travel, because like there's those ripple effects from the incarnation. The waves of grace go throughout time from Jesus Christ stepping into the pond. And so that's almost like a form of divine time travel. But then there's almost here a flip side, like a negative time travel. Of whenever I'm trying to seize something outside of when my Father in heaven wants it for me. It was I don't know, it hit me as a very powerful image.
Being confined to time.
Oof.
Yeah, it's funny. It's almost riff on the sci-fi image that you have there. There's the time travel, but there's always being contained. Even in the midst of the time travel, there's still being contained to the time machine. You can't break out of the time machine that is in the time travel, even though you might. I don't know, maybe that's a very rough analogy. But I'm thinking also just of the model that you propose to the students, a bit of your own speculation. It's an interesting and intriguing idea, which you were reading this to inform that presentation. I wonder if you could share that idea.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly in light of what you read here.
It's like, it's almost like I need a diagram. But basically, so the big thing is that we have to recognize is that when Christ came into time, and this is actually the pre-context for this actual quote. Sometimes we might be like, okay, sin is breaking out of time, but where does that come from? So it actually comes from a consideration of Christ in a specific mode of time, what the incarnation actually was. And so many of us, when we actually think of the incarnation or Christ coming into history, we tend to think of Christ either as always being in the future, like we are all waiting for his second coming kind of thing, right? And so we sometimes can be like almost like, he's coming, but he's not really in history. All of history is pointed towards Christ in the future. But one of the profound things that Balthasar, as well as Joseph Ratzinger and such, says is that, yes, there is the second coming of Jesus Christ in history, but there's also, if you will, his first coming that we can't negate. We have to pay attention to it. Because Christ is the Logos, as in the Word, and the Word being that which gives meaning and structure to our lives. And this came into the center of our human history. Therefore, our meaning is actually contained within history, because it was a full incarnation. There was nothing partial about Jesus Christ's unity with humanity, his divinity and humanity being united together. And so basically that means is that when Jesus Christ entered into that moment of time, he revealed to us that actually the meaning of human life was contained within time, not in negation of it. Now, some of us might be thinking that's a little abstract to understand, but let's think of it this way. We have this image of a pilgrim people that is often referred to the church. And in a sense, that's very correct, as in we're all progressing through our lives and we're waiting for that final destination of heaven. But if you push that image too far, you might say that the journey is only meaningful because of the destination. However, what Jesus does is by stepping into history, he actually says that the journey has meaning, as in he took it upon himself. God doesn't do things that don't have meaning, because he himself is ultimate meaning and such like that. Now, there's an argument that needs to be developed there, I realize. But yeah, so when he does that, it means that every moment that he occupied in his life, he actually sanctified and provided meaning for it. And this was not just a message for himself. This is actually a message that this is the pathway. You know,
and what's in my mind is you're sharing all of this about him coming and stepping into our journey, and not only entering into it, but becoming. It's the words of was it Catherine of Siena? All the way to heaven is heaven. For Christ said, "I am the way." So he not only steps into our journey, but he becomes our journey.
Yes. Yeah.
And in Christ saying, "I am the way," so we walk, following Christ, the sequela Christi. We walk the way of Christ.
Yeah, so I mean that's exactly what Catherine of Siena I think is talking about. It may be like a slightly different aspect, but yeah, I think that all the saints, when you actually look at them, they're all going to talk about that same dimension. Now the question, of course, comes down to, well, he came at a specific point in history, but that specific point in history is not to be viewed in isolation. He came, and it's because of his divinity. Like the paradox of Jesus Christ is fascinating, and this is why we have such a hard time understanding it, because he's fully human, therefore fully existent in time, and the divine stepping into time therefore shows its meaning. But if that's all it is about being secured in time, then we actually are all of a sudden, Jesus becomes a totally unique event that is not able to be imitated in our lives. But the big thing comes into considering now the divinity of Christ, because this is eternity stepping into time. So then Jesus comes.
If sin is breaking out of time, the incarnation is eternity
breaking into time. Yeah. And so then the big thing is that he didn't just break into this time, but rather there's what we would call the middle coming of Christ. There's the first coming, the second coming, and the middle coming. Now, the interesting thing about the middle coming is it's not just from the New Testament on to here. There's also going backwards in time, too. So a fanciful image that I provide for the class is that Jesus Christ was the petal that was thrown into the pond, and the ripple effects go throughout all of human history to the edges of the pond, both beginning and end. And so each of those ripple effects are moments in time where Jesus is incarnate in a small I incarnation,
So is there a way then, Nick, in pursuing the image, that the ripples not only go out to the edge of the pond, but there's also an echo of the ripples coming back to the center then?
Yeah. Well, it's like, St. Bonaventure talks about this rhythm, because that's where Ratzinger and Balthasar get it from. It's Bonaventure, a lot of this, and then before him, Justin Martyr. How whenever we actually are growing in holiness, we are responding to a ripple effect of grace in our time, in our lives. And we do this as people, we also do this as countries or nations in some way. Sometimes we have, as a nation or a culture, something that we respond to a little better from the incarnation, that ripple effect. And other things, there's a dark side, a blind spot, But then whenever someone actually responds to a ripple effect, they in turn send back a ripple effect. This is where another image might be helpful. That of the sower and the seed. Think instead of ripple effects, think of this arc of the sower sending a seed. and then it goes down, and then it falls onto rough soil or fertile soil or thorny soil. And so this is actually made opportune to anybody in history, And so a saint, for example, is one that allows that soil to actually take root and grow. But then what's interesting is that then the roots are sent down deep, and in effect, it's actually growing to be another Christ in one way or another.
Which will then send forth more seed.
More seed.
Yeah.
So the parable of the vine and the vineyard and stuff like that comes up to mind too. So you'll have this kind of cyclical motion that is even on display in the Gospels of Jesus Christ planting something and then it bearing fruit for Christ.
Reminds me of the image, one of my favorite images, the image of Christ the vine. That cycle of fruitfulness. That might be another podcast.
Yeah, I think that is another podcast.
Jump into that some other time.
But in that sense, therefore, now this is all very abstract in one way or another, but to bring it down to the nitty-gritty of back to this quote, therefore, to be holy in some ways is actually to accept time. And to accept that time is not just something to be endured, although there's a certain amount of enduring it to an extent, because sometimes the early church used to pray, "Come, Lord Jesus," perhaps today, this desire for God to be fully manifest. But there also had to be this patience with time, because Christ came into it and quote unquote endured it or went through it. Maybe it's a more positive way of saying it. It has value, and because Christ sends his ripple effects throughout the ages. This means, and through time, it actually shows that time is actually something that is designed by God. It is something good. And this progression of events and stuff is a manifestation of God's glory, as Thomas Aquinas says. So Christ did not come just to wait and wait and wait until that crucifixion as that one-time event that he was designed for. Rather, it was this constant unfolding of his plan from the moment he was born, or even the moment he was conceived. And that steps into, I think, exactly the Christ's example in the Gospels, because he constantly was saying, "The hour has not yet come. I am waiting for the hour. I'm waiting for this." In fact, even in the temptation in the desert, one interpretation I've heard of that, which I find very compelling, is that the temptations were not so much arbitrarily for food, like bread, or arbitrarily for fame, or arbitrarily for admiration or anything like that. It was rather, the temptation for bread was actually to inaugurate his Eucharist early, without the crucifixion, The temptation to throwing himself from the pinnacle of the temple and the angels was actually to reveal himself as who he was prematurely. And then Satan saying, "Bow down before me and I'll give you the kingdoms of the world." It's a temptation to set himself up as the king of the cosmos outside of God, his Father's plan.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's very compelling when you think of that.
Which is interesting. If we come back to that notion of all sin consists essentially in breaking out of time. So it's the call to patience.
Yes.
Patience, 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 which of course calls to mind the great hymn of love, St. Paul speaking to the Corinthians. The first thing that love is
patient.
Patient. The willingness to wait. It's interesting in the context of what you were reading. It's that sense of anticipatory anticipation, and we tend to have a sense of anticipation that is part of waiting, but I think it's actually the wrong part of waiting. That anticipation is part of impatience. I was doing a little bit of reading ahead of time, and reading ahead of time essentially is what anticipation is. It literally means to take before, to seize before, to take possession of beforehand. So it's that it's not waiting. It's just what Adam and Eve did. Is they saw that it was good and they took it ahead. They took possession of it ahead of time. That's anticipation. So in anticipation of God's promise, they seized it. They took ownership of it before God was allowed to give it to them in His time. So I was struck by that notion of anticipation, which we have that kind of anticipation, that kind of building excitement, which can really distract us from
what's actually happening.
just being in the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because there's two forms of being carried away. I think there's like an unholy one and then a holy one. But how many times do we get confused? So like there's this being carried away so that we actually are neglecting what Christ is wanting to say in that moment. You know, for example, with myself, if I know my family expects me home by a certain time in the evening after hanging out with some friends, but I'm just like so carried away and hanging out with my friends and then I'm 2 hours late. I was not exactly listening to Christ in that moment because that's where my duty was and my family was suffering because of it. You know, I wasn't exactly laying down my life for the sheep in that regard.
Is this little voice of experience
Oh,
speaking?
yes, yeah. It's always the voice of
a Lenten
experience.
sacrifice hidden in there somewhere?
Well, in COVID times, that's almost an automatic sacrifice. Anyways.
Yeah.
But then there's a holy being carried away, as in like there is this ecstasy, there's this being drawn into something, and this so complete self-forgetfulness, which is good, actually. And so that's actually sometimes even a sign of a charism, which is that you are so into self-gift mode that you are self-forgetful. And so, you know, like that's actually not so much an escape from time, but in a complete immersion, as in you are giving exactly as you're supposed to in that moment. So that's a good carried away. The other one's not so great because it's not saying, is this the time for this? This one is like, this is the time, you know.
I wonder if it's a distinction, as we were mentioned earlier. So I mentioned earlier, anticipation, expectancy. Is there a difference between anticipation and expectancy?
Well, I guess expectancy would be expecting good things, right? Like, and even hoping for good things, right?
And hope may be the key.
Yeah.
Because if there's hope, then there's a willingness to be patient.
Yeah.
God in his time, and it's a theological virtue, so given by God, the strength, the virtue, to be able to wait in firm knowledge that in the right time, things will be given. Yeah, that sense of anticipation, I have that sense, it is the grasping hand. You find that even, think of a little child who is so anticipating Christmas, I can't wait, it's like that, I can't wait for Christmas to come. And what does that mean then? Well, they might actually be living in that moment which has not yet come, seizing it because there's that impatience. And the word patience, just reflecting on that, the root of that, the origin of that is suffering.
Yeah.
To suffer time.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually that's something that I think is a nice segue into the rest of the conversation, because when we talk about anticipating something and we say it's actually important for us to wait in time for things, if sin is truly breaking out of time, trying to seize a good prematurely, you know. For example, you know, one of the key analogies that's striking into my mind is even like the virtue of chastity before marriage, you know, the growing in familiarity of boyfriend, girlfriend, and, you know, ideally, and it's supposed to, in God's plan, to culminate in sexual intimacy in marriage. But impatience in that regard leads to a breaking out of time. It is not time to be doing that.
Anticipating what will be by seizing it ahead of time.
Exactly.
Yeah. A possessiveness. Which is interesting, just to interject for a moment. We refer to something we'd mentioned a couple of podcasts ago of Pope Francis's letter on St. Joseph.
Yeah.
Where chastity is defined as of being free from a possessiveness.
Yeah.
So in a way, in the context of our conversation, you'd say chastity is all about patience.
Yeah, it's funny. The virtues they're all distinct in their own manner, but they all connect. You know, because chastity and patience, chastity actually technically links to temperance, and patience actually keeps in mind temperance, but it also is mostly connected to fortitude, because it's all about this persevering.
That strength, that's mentioned in the follow-up to what you were talking about. The fortitude is a strength. I love this little litany that is given in here. So you'd mentioned about more central than humility. Patience is the power to wait, to persevere, to hold out, to endure to the end, not to transcend one's own limitations, not to force issues by playing the hero or the titan, but to practice the virtue that lies beyond heroism, the meekness of the lamb which is led.
Oof.
Which, that is a suffering. That is a suffering to lay down what we expect for ourselves or anticipate and just say, in God's time, to be led. So you see the depth of surrender to circumstance, even to some form of the limitations, the weaknesses, even some form of impoverishment.
Yeah. And that is suffering because, I don't think there's any, for example, young person, aka someone around my age, that doesn't have the image of the Titan or the hero in their
Duly
head.
noted, Nick. Thank you.
Yes, well, I'm not saying that you've given up on the concept. I don't comment on that
I
at all.
don't hope to become a Titan.
I hope to become a Titan.
I am a Titan. No,
I am
sorry.
a Titan. That'll be cool. Titans are fun, but and heroes are fun too. But but the image of wanting to be a hero or being the one to solve the situation, it reminds me, Friedrich Nietzsche's will to power and the Superman is like honestly I think the image most of us deal with on a day-to-day basis. I'll do it myself by my own power. I'll seize the day, carpe diem.
In my own time.
In my own time.
Yeah.
I am almost the Lord of time in that way. And like when you actually look at a lot of sin, it's either in a very obvious way, this brash, prideful manner, but even false humility actually has that, where I'm going to, not trust God's time or God's judgment, and I'm going to trust my own judgment in myself that I'm actually decrepit. So therefore, it's kind of this backwards, kind of twisted overestimation of our own judgment. And actually, false humility is a rejection of time that, yes, you can get better over time. No, time does nothing to me. There's
I'm immune to time.
I'm immune to time. Time, there's no hope for me. So it's funny how there's no time and no hope kind of connects.
Yeah.
And so, that's something for me that kind of hits me in there. And I honestly think that is probably the most difficult thing in our particular times of coming to know the gospel. To realize that that self-abandon, that self-surrender, whatever language you need to express it to yourself, is so vital because it's actually surrendering your time.
Yeah.
It's surrendering your plans, even having that patience.
So reflecting on this, I was thinking of chapter 4 in Amoris Laetitia.
Okay.
Where Pope Francis does this beautiful, reflective, kind of a Jesuit consciousness examine reflection through St. Paul's hymn of love in 1 Corinthians 13. And he actually breaks it down with these reflections on each. And of course, the first one is love is patient. And the Greek word for patient there is, I'm pronouncing it wrong, I'm sure, but macrotheme, I think it is, which translates most literally to long suffering.
Oh, okay.
It's just long, over time, and suffering. So it's entering into that time and that willingness to wait and the willingness to surrender. He applies that, of course, to family relationships. Could apply to all relationships, but that notion of patience.
Yeah. And actually, even at the foot of the cross, we see that temptation to impatience, that Christ went through. For example, there's those three groups that mock him, and actually the Sanhedrin come up to him and say, if you're the Son of God, come down.
Which he
could have.
And will.
Will.
In his own,
but
in his own time, in his own way. Not yet,
In fact, it's funny because even in some films and stuff, you'll see like the older military general and the younger, more impatient captain, like managing forces on a battlefield. And it's just like the captain's like, I want to go now. And then the older general's wait, hold,
till you see the whites of their eyes.
Yeah, exactly, something like that. And I think that actually, it's funny that you actually have that dynamic often in film because the younger is more impatient, ready to go. There's this irascible energy, this energy to overcome obstacles, which can so easily turn into the Titan, but it has a place. And then the older insight, this fatherly general or something like that, which is often in these things, is much more patient, much more waiting, biding their time, being wise about these things, which is actually really funny because St. Augustine says that patience is, the virtue of patience leads to wisdom. Because after a while, if you think of what wisdom is, which is seeing everything properly in its place, in the harmony of the whole, and such, you realize...
In the way that God would see things.
They say that wisdom is divine, because it actually sees things, everything from where it's actually supposed to be in a plan.
From an eternal perspective,
Yes,
perhaps.
yeah. We never tire of talking about eternal perspective here, of course. So yeah, I guess it comes down to, how do we grow in patience, And some people even listening may even have still a certain part of their heart where it's just like, but I want to do things for the Lord, I want to have a mission.
With a tone of impatience.
With a tone of impatience. It's just like, are you telling me to be patient? But gosh darn it, I have these gifts and I've been given them and I want to get it to it now. Yeah.
I think just what we were speaking about, this notion of the eternal perspective, is essential to this. As I'm pondering this, you realize there's the two different kinds of time that are spoken of. There's chronos time, that chronological one moment after another moment after another moment, which is so often the context within which we grow impatient. And then there's the kairos time, this time that is God's time, the time of rightness and ripeness. And I find for myself, if I'm willing to humble myself and accept the limitation of chronos time, I actually become free to receive the kairos time. Following God and abiding in God, as Christ says, abide in me, and just practicing what we always call and we speak about so often, that duty of the moment, entering into the sacrament of the moment, the encounter with God. But the eternal perspective, as I was pondering this, I think a lot of it, and see what you think about this one, Nick, but I think a lot of it is that we just have a very false understanding of what eternity is, because we're temporal beings. We tend to project temporality, like chronos, onto eternity, which is really kairos. But that's because that's all we've ever known. As we're reflecting on this, you realize even in the book of Genesis, the first thing that God creates, we tend to think it's light, but it's not. It says in the first three words, in the beginning.
Yeah.
There can't be a beginning unless there is time. So you realize that actually an argument could be made that God's first creature was time. Carving it out of his eternity. But if we tend to view eternity as just a very, 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 very infinitely long amount of chronos, I think that's why we kind of tire even of the idea of heaven. White robes and sitting on clouds strumming hearts forever. Oof, how boring is that? And even some of the ways that are used to describe eternity, like going and picking up one grain of sand from the beach and traveling 100 miles and dropping it off and going back and picking another one. And when that beach is totally empty, eternity has only just begun. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how tedious is that?
Who wants to be doing that for eternity?
And I think that's that progression, that's that projection of chronos, of our own temporality. Whereas what is God? If God is timeless, then that's what eternity is timelessness without the restriction of time. The eternal now. The way I describe eternity to the students, and I reflect on myself, and I personally find it much more engaging, and I'm willing to be patient for that kind of eternity, and in that kind of eternity, is think for a moment, see what you think of this. Think for a moment of one time in your life when you were supremely, like sublimely content.
Yeah.
Just some moment, and maybe it's usually some significant moment. Maybe it was a memory from Christmas, or a birthday, or the birth of a child, or a marriage, or whatever. One of those moments when all of a sudden you just felt like everything is right in this moment. Everything is as it should be. Take that moment and then expand it by, a factor of a billion, billion, billion.
The largest number you can think of.
That moment, and simply to be in that moment, with no past, no future, just to be, absolutely, infinitely.
With no diminishing of that sublimity.
There could be no diminishing because it's infinite. That moment in infinity is eternity.
Yeah, and you could even say 10 times that.
Well, 10 times infinity would be...
It's still infinity.
Which reminds me of something my mother said to me when I was a boy going out fishing with a friend, and she said, so, what are you doing? I said, we're going fishing. We're going to split our catch in half. And she said, well, half of nothing is nothing, which wasn't the most encouraging thing as we're going out fishing, but she was actually quite right. So it was probably a prophetic word, half of nothing was nothing.
Yeah.
But we had fun.
I'm sure. Sometimes there's the pleasure in the activity itself.
Right. So what's 10 times infinity?
Well, it's still infinite.
Infinity.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny that you say that, Jim, because the eternity at the center of heaven, I agree. Like, we can't comprehend eternity. It's something that steps out of our human modes of knowing, It is mystery. It doesn't mean that we can't know something about it, but that every time we try to fit in our brains, it's our brains that bust, So we always use images. And I really like that. There's another image that I've received recently. You're kind of focusing on the divine heaven perspective, as in, like, in heaven there's eternity and such. Then there's also the new earth in many ways. Like, in a sense, there seems to be a suggestion in the concept of the new earth and materiality in the new heavens and new earth that suggests that time will actually even be sanctified and redeemed to back what it was supposed to be. And that kind of, I think, flows from the fact that we human beings properly exist in time because we have bodies. So at the resurrection of the body, there will be this reunification. And so I heard one priest last year actually describe it this way. He said, I think he was talking about the new earth kind of dimension of the new heavens and new earth. And he said, often in our lives, we will have the pleasure of the pursuit and the pleasure of the gained. For example, there's a pleasure sometimes in the hike towards a specific destination, and you enjoy the activity for itself. For example, with your friend going fishing and not catching anything, there was a pleasure in that activity itself.
Oh, absolutely. So a day well spent.
A day well spent.
In the pursuit.
No results to show for it, but it was well spent, Why do we say that? Because there was something worthwhile in and of itself. And then, but it's funny because sometimes when we reach the destination, we're like, all of a sudden there's a shift in pleasures, which is to say that we have now entered into discovery, the joy of discovery. The pursuit and then the discovery. And there's a certain satisfaction that comes from that. But that means saying goodbye to the pleasure of pursuit, So he actually argued that in heaven, the new heavens and the new earth, we will actually see these two pleasures magnified and held in tandem, which is...
A beautiful notion.
Oh, yeah, I think it's really cool because if you actually think about what heaven is, it's this constant pursuit of God and constantly arriving, but there's always more because God in himself is eternal and infinite. And so, and actually it's funny because if you actually introduce the concept of patience again, we can sometimes impatiently run towards our destination. And then when we get there, we get impatient for the pursuit again. So even in these dimensions in our earthly life, we actually have to have this taking it in. And not, slowly meandering, but this actual regulated pace,
It kind of returns to an image that we were speaking of earlier, Nick, the Catherine Siena quote of all the way to heaven is heaven. Christ in the incarnation entering into our existence becomes the path that we walk. So it has that sense of what is hoped for and what is experienced now. It's rather what the liturgy is. It is experienced now and yet to be. Held in an awkward tension for us now, but in token of what heaven will be, what eternity will be. I think for myself it is that grappling and wrestling with chronos time that breeds impatience. Surrendering through humility to kairos time, letting God be God and working things out as he chooses in my life. He who is the eternal now, always now, and entering into that moment, is kairos time, and there's a great amount of peace that comes there, and the strength, the virtue of patience that comes with it.
Yeah, it's through the kairos that we find the Christos, in many ways. It's through the present that we find Christ. There's also something that kind of keys into my brain, which is, we talked about the hero that we all desire to be in the moment, right? But there's such a heroism of the moment in actually laying down one's life, laying down one's desires, not to get rid of them, but to actually have them be purified. in one way or another. Like Pope Francis actually talks about this, and I think this is what he's doing. When he talks to youth, he says, you have to pursue your dreams. And that means we always have to check our desires, because we actually don't have dreams without desires. There's an intrinsic connection. Now, some, when the document came out, criticized that move because they're like, dreams are sometimes unrealistic. They need to be purified. But I think...
Purified by what?
Purified, exactly,
Realism.
Realism.
Well, I don't know, but that can truncate hope.
Well, yeah, and but the thing is like, of course, like when you begin talking about dreams and stuff like that, there is a certain danger here, because with dreams, there's always the question of how do we get there? And what am I going to do to get there? And am I going to be impatient or not? And, and so the big thing though too is that it's actually easier for the Lord to work with a heart in motion than a heart that's staying still and depressed, So yeah, like I don't think there's no reason why Christ was able to converse and convert prostitutes and tax collectors versus the Pharisees. It was very difficult for him to talk with those who had knowledge because they felt like they'd actually already arrived. Whereas tax collectors and prostitutes, they had this ferocious desire happening, which got them into a lot of trouble. But then it precisely was the thing that Christ was able to appeal to, the restless heart. And so the big thing here is that there is this heroism in actually grappling with our desire, having our dreams, and having them be pushed up against the cross of Christ. And this surrender of, Lord, I give you my dream, that's a heroic thing.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's the virtue. That's what meekness is. Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is a profound strength.
Yeah.
That really only grows in God with huge amounts of trust.
Exactly. Yeah. And so this is not just some kind of resignation or something like that, or this suppression of dreams, or this naive following of a dream to the negation of all else, because that does get into that impatience. But there is this hopeful pursuit of a dream saying, you know what, the only way that's going to get there is by me paying attention, working hard, persevering in that patient manner, and just listening.
Catherine Doherty's had this kind of a Catherine Doherty quote, which of course ends up being a point to ponder. Like, what on earth does she mean?
Yeah.
And she speaks about dreams. She says, dreams dreamt in God come true. And I wonder, in light of what you're saying, if that's it. It's like a dream that is purified by being surrendered to God, and being willing to be patient, and let God unfold things, is just that. It's a purification, and it will come true in God as God wills it to be, because ultimately all of our desires, and hence our dreams, are oriented towards God. Isn't that what actually gets us in trouble? Coming back to what was being mentioned earlier, that acting in anticipation, that seizing ahead, that breaking out of time, that when I seek to fulfill my desires on my own terms rather than on God's terms, is that not what sin truly is? Our desires actually do orient us towards heaven. So I was pondering this too. I was thinking, well, is not even the experience of impatience expressive of a desire to seize eternity?
Yeah.
For myself, rather than being patient and saying, okay, I'll submit to God working things out in time. So even that, that wrestling with impatience can be a desire that, surrendered to God, orients us in the right way. Yeah.
And I think something kind of worthwhile noting too about impatience is that often it can be very naturally understandable. Like, there's almost like in that capacity of the soul to be irascible, this tendency to overcome obstacles. This is a natural part of us, and it actually has a purpose. But this is precisely why fortitude, the ancients thought, was the governing virtue for it, because it was able to fine-tune it. It wasn't supposed to suppress it or say, stop that. There is this desire and this energy to overcome obstacles, which just needs tempering and pointing in the right direction. And sometimes it even needs to be directed in surprising ways. In fact, irascibility, according to some of the ancient church fathers, had to be primarily directed against the self. This overcoming of self.
Growing in self-control.
And in fact,
self-mastery.
With some early church fathers saying that it's never permissible to be angry with someone else, it's always permissible to be angry with yourself. Now, what they're saying is basically, they're not saying be angry with yourself all the time. But really, if you have an anger pop up in yourself about someone else, actually to basically start being angry with that anger as you don't belong here. That is a person in the image and likeness of God. Why are you angry? Why are you thinking these terrible thoughts about that person?
That reminds me of Pope Francis's reflections on love is patient.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. It's can I accept people as they are in my life, or do I make demands that they need to be as I think they should be?
So this impatience with the other.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this perseverance, this willingness to suffer with. So, when you actually break down the etymology, that makes a lot of sense.
The long suffering.
The long suffering.
Over time.
And that sounds a lot like community.
Yeah.
Because the long suffering of community.
Which can be done with a huge amount of joy.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why, Pope Francis, again, the joy of love. There's a depth of joy that comes. So even with wrestling with impatience and growing in patience and being willing to submit, to surrender in humility, the limitations of being temporal beings, there can be deep joy. Filled with hope.
Yeah.
Strong in faith.
Yeah. So one thing that maybe is a good thought to close on is we're actually filming this podcast at the beginning of Lent. It was just Ash Wednesday a couple days ago.
Yeah.
And it strikes me,
Hence the black atmosphere.
The black
atmosphere. This ashen atmosphere. It's the same color as palm ash, isn't it?
I guess so, actually. Yes. But it's black all year. So, I guess we're just in Lent all year.
There is an element of that.
Yeah.
Patience.
Patience. Yeah.
The word Lent means, from the Old
length.
English, lengthening of days. So it's about long suffering. Lent suffering.
So you could say Lent is the season of patience.
I think so. It's maybe this is what you were. Maybe I'm anticipating what you were saying, jumping ahead, taking possession of it here. Forgive me. But the notion of prayer, fasting, almsgiving, all could be oriented to growing in
patience. Well, maybe that's exactly what it's supposed to be doing. Obviously, all things are subordinated to love. But then, love is kind of the tip of a pyramid, but it has all these supporting virtues, And love kind of is the form of all the virtues, but it doesn't mean that we are not called to do these other virtues too. And and patience, I think, is precisely one of them. The big thing here that's interesting is that Lent, one of the big key texts for Lent in the Bible that we actually focus on is precisely the temptation in the desert.
In the desert, the 40 days.
The 40 days of going out with Jesus in the desert and having Christ conquer these things in ourselves and uniting ourselves to him. And these temptations are also present on the cross to an extent, specifically in the three mockeries, actually. That's a new typology, another time. But, how many times have we gotten in trouble in our Lenten practices by being to hell with this.
Jumping ahead.
Yeah. Wanting Easter now. And so, I think that's actually really interesting. And for myself, I think I'm going to be carrying forward into Lent just a little more focus on being patient with myself, with others, and even with my God. Aching desires and the dreams I want, and even allowing those dreams to be purified.
By God, yeah. And that's a patience with God too.
Yeah.
How often we are impatient with God. It's he's working, he's doing his thing in his time, and his time is perfect. Yeah, I'm hearing in my mind and my heart, the great cry, Christ is alive.
He is
our hope. And I think in Lent what we do is we live in the He is our hope. We're not quite ready to celebrate Christ is alive, even though we do. We live in that moment. So it's a moment that is now and not yet. In that beautiful gap of now and not yet is where patience can grow.
Yeah, no, I think that's the crucible. That's our miniature crucifixions.
Indeed.
Well, I think we've probably meandered on a little bit, as much as we should probably, in this one.
It's funny, in our conversation, you could see that happened right there. We're kind of wandering along, looking at everything on the roadsides as we're going, and then all of a sudden we just kind of came to a standstill and we're looking.
Well, I don't know about you. I just thought of 3 or 4 other things that's that needs to get looked at. But maybe for another day.
Good place to pause.
Yeah.
We can be patient.
Exactly. Stay tuned for... No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, but thanks to everyone tuning in for this podcast. As usual, if something in this podcast really struck you and you would like to reach out or you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the YouTube comments or even send an email to St. Therese Institute. We'll try our best to get to it.
Yep.
We enjoy doing this as a service.
And thank you for your patience in our waywardness. Just a little wayward.
Just a little wayward, that's right. All right, so this has been a Little Wayward podcast where we do little very well. God bless.